Hello again. I thought it might be interesting to revisit the notorious speech which Enoch Powell gave in April 1968 and which is believed by many people these days to be a racist diatribe. Of course, the truth is that Enoch Powell was not a racist. He had Indian friends and Indians stayed at his home when they visited this country. His view was simply the common sense one of India for the Indians and British for the British, although even that is now regarded as a shockingly racist perspective, of course. Anyway, let's reread Powell's speech from the vantage point of the modern world and see what we can make of it. In the description to this video, I give a link to the full text of the speech. It begins with a preamble in which Powell talks of the way in which we confuse predicting something with actually causing it. This is prescient because it is precisely the fate which befell Powell himself. He said, if only they love to think, if only people wouldn't talk about it, it probably wouldn't happen. Perhaps this habit goes back to the primitive belief that the word and the thing, the name and the object are identical. Well, of course, he did talk about it. And the result is that over half a century later, he's widely despised by liberal and progressive types in this country. He went on to tell the audience what had been said to him by one of his constituents in the Midlands town of Wolverhampton. He said, a week ago, I fell into conversation with a constituent, a middle-aged, quite ordinary working man employed in one of our nationalised industries. This is important because today anti-racist writers like Rennie Edo Lodge, author of the awful book Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, often attribute the words which Powell quoted to him and forget that he was quoting somebody else. For example, among other things, this man said to Powell, who was his MP at the time, in this country, in 15 or 20 years' time, the black man will have the whip hand over the white man. Very often you'll hear people saying that that was a prediction that Powell made. It wasn't. He was quoting one of his constituents. He went on to say, after quoting this fellow, I can already hear the chorus of execration. How dare I say such a horrible thing? How dare I stir up trouble and inflame feelings by repeating such a conversation? The answer is that I do not have the right not to do so. Here is a decent, ordinary fellow Englishman who in broad daylight in my own town says to me, his Member of Parliament, that this country will not be worth living in for his children. Quite right too, he did not have the right to remain silent, because this was something many people were beginning to think and say in the 1960s. Powell went on to look at some projections given the current level of immigration at that time and said that by 2000 it was possible that 10% of the country would be non-white. Of course, these days it's at least 15%. We're still waiting for the latest figures on ethnicity from the survey, the census held last year. And I suspect that more than 15% of the country will turn out to be non-white now. So what that means is that he was actually being conservative in his estimates. Nevertheless, Powell was mocked and ridiculed at the time and accused of wildly exaggerating. If anything, he underestimated the scale of the problem. He then described the numbers entering Britain at that time from the Indian subcontinent and the Caribbean, and said that it would be wise to halt this flow. He followed this by saying that an element of the Conservative Party's policy is that all who are in this country as citizens should be equal before the law, and there shall be no discrimination or difference made between them by public authority. As Mr. Heath, who was the Prime Minister, the leader of the opposition rather at that time in 1968, later Prime Minister, as Mr. Heath has put it, we will have no first-class citizens and second-class citizens. This does not mean that the immigrant and his descendants should be elevated into that position, or that the citizen should be denied his right to discriminate in his management of his own affairs between one fellow citizen and another. I will leave it to viewers to decide whether or not the immigrant and his descendants have, as Powell put it, been elevated into a privileged and special class. Some of us think that they have been. How about this description of what some British people were experiencing in certain parts of the country? Again, from Powell's speech in 1968, they found their wives unable to obtain hospital beds in childbirth, their children unable to obtain school places, their homes and neighbourhoods changed beyond recognition, their plans and prospects for the future defeated. At work, they found that employers hesitated to apply to the immigrant worker the standard of discipline and competence required of the native-born worker. Any of that sound familiar? There is absolutely nothing in that speech that any normal and fair-minded person could dismiss as racist. Powell simply described a situation which existed in 1968 in certain small parts of the country, and he extrapolated forward into the future and speculated that these trends might, if immigration were not brought under control, eventually become the way that every white person in Britain would be living. I wonder if any viewers think that he was mistaken about this, or perhaps exaggerating. Enoch Powell was not a racist. He first destroyed his political career in 1959 by denouncing the concentration camps which the British were running in Kenya during the Mau Mau rising in that country. He thought that what was being done there to Africans was shocking and wrong, and although other MPs begged him to keep quiet, he made a speech about that, publicising what he saw as dreadful cruelty and injustice against black people in Africa. Anybody who describes Powell as a racist must be a complete fool. Anyway, I thought it would be interesting to look at that speech briefly in retrospect.